Welcome to the Mega Blast Podcast. I'm your host, Jason McDonald. My goal is to get to the truth through conversation. The Mega Blast Podcast is produced by Arts and Opinion, an online journal housed at the Archives of Canada. Visit us at artsandopinion.com. I hope you enjoy today's guest. Hello, Martin. How you doing?
Hi, Jason. How are you?
Good, good.
Good.
Thanks for coming on my podcast a second time.
Yeah, it's let's not make this a habit.
Yeah. The people are going to start to talk, right?
Yeah.
Martin and Jason meeting all the time on Zoom. Okay, so the objective, I'm here with Martin Deck of Windsor, Ontario for the second time. We spoke last time, we had a really good conversation about reggae and punk. If anyone is listening to this and wants to go back and listen to that. Just on a quick note, Martin, congratulations. You're the second most listened to guest I have after
That's
Chris
awesome.
Berry. Yeah. And Chris Berry is actually, he's kind of well known. He's got more than you. And so I don't know if that's your mailing list. My producer thinks maybe you have a lot of people that you're sending it out to. That's his theory, but I don't know.
Just shared it on Facebook. I don't know. It's maybe people are clamoring for my wisdom about reggae music because I haven't posted to my blog in 6 years.
Yeah, well, and you've also got an article in the Pipes you're working on as well about Jack. Is it
I hope
Jackie
so.
Too? Yeah. So
Yeah.
Something else.
That's kind of been stalled, but yeah.
You'll get back to that. Maybe when that, because I promised my producer wanted to publish that. He said your writing was very good. He went to your blog. He's like, this guy can write.
Yeah.
So that's something we can put to the side, and maybe that could be a second podcast. Maybe you could come and explain it to
Well,
I don't know.
When I write it.
Yeah, just quickly just so people understand it. There's a Canadian reggae artist. His name, Jamaican Canadian, called Jackie Me Too, right?
Yes, and also Willie Williams.
Willie Williams.
Willie Williams. Together they made Armageddon Time, and the Clash covered it. And I want to.
I think you can get in touch with Willie Williams.
I'm not quite all the way.
Okay.
I got to get with his contact person, press manager, maybe. I don't know what.
Wow. Okay. Well, you're moving up the food chain because he's sort of a legend in reggae circles, at least. For sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the objective of this podcast is to talk about the cultural phenomenon of Tintin and Hergé, and you and I are both huge fans, and so we're planning to do this probably in 2 episodes. I mean, it might end up being 3. I'm not sure, but I'm thinking probably 2, just because we're both very loquacious, right? So
that is true.
Yeah. So we're going to start, at least if this is part 1, we're going to sort of go through chronologically about the books, and then also how they connect to Hergé and his life and what was going on in Europe and everything at that time. Right. So I don't know if, technically the first book is in the land of Soviets. I don't know. Yeah.
Yes, which I have read, which I have. This book, let's just jump into my story.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
So I was born and raised in Windsor, Ontario, which is across the river from Detroit, but is also a center of French culture in Canada, in North America, for over 300 years. The city of Detroit was founded in 1700 something or other, and Windsor is based on the settlements that happened across the river. And the French people settled here a long time ago. And so anyway, I was born and raised in Windsor, totally Anglophone, but was sent to a French grade school where I was surrounded by French kids who were huge fans of Tintin and Asterix and stuff like that, which was well stocked by the school library. So basically, I had access to all Tintin in French.
And so you read them in French at first, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
But some of them, I think I also, my parents bought in English for home. And we'd bring our French Tintins home and have my dad read them to us. And my dad was a brilliant guy. He was a philosophy professor, and he knew many languages like, Greek, Latin, German, French.
Wow.
And he understood it. I'm not sure how well he could ever speak it, but he intentionally spoke it poorly when he read to us so that we would correct him.
Oh, interesting.
And it's kind of a
sort
way
of learning exercise.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it was always extra comedic to have it read to you in this kind of halting, fake, illiterate way,
and deliberately screwing the genders up or whatever, kind of like deliberately. Oh no, Papa, it's this or that or whatever. Yeah.
But so it's very highly tied with those memories. But then also, just reading and reading and reading. I read all that I could get my hands on, and then I think it's in 1971 or 2. Something like that this book came out, Au Pays des Soviets. And
it was just to speak a little bit on that. It was originally, like, when he started, he first published the first strip of that in 1929. And it was in a Le Petit Vingtième, which was a weekly magazine in Brussels. And it was just a weekly, kind of like in the old newspapers, they had weekly funnies and things like that. So it was just a strip. So the early books are all like this. Like, I was rereading Tintin in America today, and it's just this sort of halting thing, one after. It's so different from the later books. There's no,
and it's really interesting reading them. I haven't got very far in the series, but reading them in chronological order is so interesting because you really see how he starts to become a real storyteller instead of just this kind of, I think they eventually got, or maybe immediately, they were published as pages. It was like one page of the magazine was Tintin.
I'm not sure. That's a good question. That's something we could fact check.
Yeah.
It could be that it was, I believe it was just one strip in the very early period.
Okay. Yeah, in the very early period.
Tintin magazine, they had full pages, but I'm not sure.
And in this book, they're basically just 6 panels per page.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So that could easily have been like originally a strip. But then in the slightly later books, starting with, I think, The Broken Ear, it's like he is telling a story, but it's got to be in these little episodes.
Right.
Every page has a cliffhanger, and every next page starts with a new, starts with the end of that cliffhanger. It's very episodic and very, I'd say, random. Like
it feels very like Tintin in America, for example. It just feels very rote. It feels like it's almost like a situation comedy. Like put Tintin in a dangerous situation, something happens, and you can see the sort of the germination of his character and everything. But like, I'm reading it, sort of comparing it to the later books, and they're so much more complex. We're going to get to them in the second podcast.
Yeah, and there was somebody before Tintin called Totor, but I've never delved into the Totor universe. But
I think that's something that's out of the purview of this, is the influences of Tintin. I'm not really sure about that. I wanted to talk a little bit just about the germination of Alger and Belgium. I mean, what's interesting to me is you mentioned that your father was an American, and then you mentioned growing up in Windsor, there's this long-standing connection to to French culture, French North America, let's say. So Canada's a bilingual country. Yeah. Belgium is also a bilingual.
That's right.
And I don't like, there seems to be some connection, perhaps. I don't know if that's why we're fans, but I
mean, it's interesting because there are diehard Tintin fans all around the world.
That's true. So I'm not making too much out of it.
Especially all the way across Europe. I don't know if I told you before, Jason, that I met a guy, not really, but just through Facebook, who basically he started, I think he contacted me because my avatar is Tintin.
Oh yeah.
Right.
That's nice.
I don't know what I've been commenting about, something musical, but it turns out we have very many musical taste overlaps.
Interesting. Along with the Tintin thing. Yeah, that's wow. So that's a funny and also you and I are like that too. That's
in a way, but I mean, if I may say, like, this guy's a tie.
I don't mean that. Maybe, go ahead.
This guy's a diehard reggae fan, and one of his favorite bands, and very few people that I know will say this. One of his very favorite bands is Dexy's Midnight Runners. So that's also true of me. So it's just kind of remarkable how much. So
is there a crossover there?
Tintin, but the connection that Tintin brings too, and so he's got a rabid fandom across.
It's. I don't want to make too much of the bilingual thing, but just that one of the things that occurs to me is Belgium and Canada share a lot of commonality. I mean, there's obviously differences. I mean, Canada is enormous and Belgium is very small, but there's a few interesting commonalities. There's two groups of people who are. Pierre Trudeau said in one of his essays that neither side is strong enough to overcome the other, really, right? You have that in Belgium, it's even closer to 50-50. I think it's like 60-40. In Canada, it's about, 22.5% French-speaking, which is 22.5% is enough that there's a significant portion of the country. So you have that. The other thing that's interesting that's similar about the two countries is, if you've been to Brussels, you'll know this. Everybody in Brussels speaks French. I mean, it's like you go around, everybody's speaking French, but it's actually situated in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, right? Which is very similar to how Montreal is. I mean, it's not more extreme in Belgium, but Montreal has a very strong Anglophone component and English-speaking backbone. It has, you know what I mean? Yet it's surrounded in Quebec by, by this. So I wonder about these things. So you get these there's sort of maybe there's a way of looking at the world from the perspective of a bilingual and bicultural country that's different if you're in, for example, India or the UK or some country with many different, like India has many, right? The UK has a few different sub-nationalities. There's England and then there's Scotland. Then there's some countries that have almost none, like the United States. They have almost no. Sort of sub-nationalities totally, maybe Texans. I don't know. Is that
I see what you mean, but no, I mean, there's very strong.
Well, it's just that I think that there's a long history in Canada of with the duality of basically compromise between these two groups, right?
Yes, that's true.
Right. I think that is probably true in Belgium as well. There's a kind of there's these two different groups and they can't overcome each other. They have to work together. They don't always get along, right?
Yeah,
so you have to find, right?
It's funny too, because I actually think, and I may be completely wrong, but I think Belgium is in continually greater danger of falling apart than Canada is.
Both countries have it all the time. Yes, I think it's even worse in Belgium.
And it's funny too, I came up with this line, and it's really just for comedic purposes. I don't think there's anything too deep in it, but it goes like this. Belgium was the first mistake, then Benelux. Then
it was the second.
It's like you just can't, you can't, you're different. So
you can't push them all together, right? No, it's interesting because it's also because it really demarcates. Belgium is very different. Like, it contains the linguistic groups of both of its neighbors, right? It contains a French speaking and a Dutch speaking. Yet it's totally different from those two countries. Right?
I'd love to go there. I've never been anywhere.
Have you been to France or the Netherlands?
No, not yet.
Those, all of Europe is really, and the Netherlands is really cool, and so is France. But those countries have much more of a kind of a, although the Dutch are very known for compromise, but the French are very sort of doggedly, like, there's like a nationality and you're a part of it, and they're very. I like that about France. I like the way especially the way they're like. They sort of push this idea that race is not important, or it's like French first, it's French first, at least you're supposed to be.
Right? What I was going to say though was, that's all interesting. What I was thinking about earlier was both, and I was going to say this, but going back to my story, I may skip and I
go ahead.
But I don't know exactly why I suddenly wanted to read French again after, I went to a French grade school. I took a little bit of French in in high school, a little bit of French in university just for easy credits because I already knew
right, because you knew it all.
But then I just didn't read it for like, I don't know, 15 years, 20 years.
Interesting.
And then in the early 2000s, I was like, I want to read French again. And I picked up a book and I was like, this is pretty tough.
So you went back to the comic books.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I went back to the Tintin and I read, I don't know how many, we just split up my mom's books, but
interesting.
I took a few of them, of the Tintins. My nephew took most of them, but there were about half and half French and English. So I read as many as I could. I might have even taken some out of the library, but I read them all. And then I read Simenon, Georges Simenon, the Belgian French writer who invented Inspector Maigret.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned him the other day.
He is renowned for being a very easy read because he writes in short sentences and uses almost only common words. So you get introduced to the entire, I would say the entire geography of Paris and a bunch of the geography of France, because he's mostly based in Paris, but every once in a while he goes on holiday. And when he does, a crime happens that he has to solve. So he's great. And a lot like Tintin in that manner, that he's
so it's sort of a mystery solving, puzzle solving.
Exactly. And going places, going and in the I really got a sense of the without ever having been there, of the arrondissements of Paris.
Arrondissement, yeah. Paris is built on a spiral. So it's sort of like a kind of taking the grid idea and using a spiral instead. It's very weird. So it starts out with the first one in the middle, and then second and third and fourth, and so on, so that the 17th can be right next to the 5th or something, like just geographically.
Did you know that Detroit is its original design was a spoked wheel?
Wow,
and that was the French who did that.
That was a French design.
And then a grid was imposed on top of it, and blah 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 blah.
Interesting, yeah. Well, that's something that happens in North America in a variety of places where the French and the British systems collided. In Manitoba, for example, with Louis Riel, the original, there was a debate over, because in Quebec, if you go down the St. Lawrence, you'll notice that all the farms are like long strips coming
right. That's the way we. Right. That's the way they did it.
It's a seigneurial system, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a conflict in the 19th century in Manitoba over that, because the Anglo settlers wanted to impose the square system, and they eventually did. Right. Yeah. It sounds like something similar happened in Detroit, right?
And in Windsor, actually, we had just the strips at first, and then the grid was imposed. So it's like there's some very long blocks.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. So I wonder if there's something about the duality that attracts us, because we're both. I grew up. I mean, my personal story is not quite. The duality was not important at the beginning, because I didn't grow up in a French-speaking environment at all.
Right.
I didn't even know Tintin was in French when I was a kid. I just discovered it in the school library, I think, because it's so long ago. Like, I was a tiny kid, you know. Yeah. I started reading these books, and then I got really into it, and then I was a fan ever since. You know, I've been a fan all my life. And so, I mean, later on later on, I read them in French. I read them all in French. And I've even, in some other languages I was studying, when I was studying German, I would get them in German.
Right, exactly. It just makes sense, because it's nice short sentences.
Right, and you can see the pictures, you can learn the vocabulary, right? It's, So there could be something to do with the duality. The one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about Hergé's upbringing, just, because it's important in how Tintin manifests himself. Like in Tintin and the Soviets, very anti-Soviet, right?
Yeah.
It's clearly, so Tintin, Hergé, Georges Remy was his real name.
Yeah.
He seems to have had a very sort of middle class, traditional upbringing, sort of very Catholic, conservative upbringing. And that's another similarity between Belgium and Canada, is the religion is deeply embedded in the schools there. Right. Which is true in this country as well. And the language sort of correlates there as well. There could be something
for sure. And I went to a French Catholic school.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Like most of here in Quebec, most of the French Canadians went to, this is before the reforms, right? Catholic schools. And so in our Constitution, the Canadian Constitution, Catholic and Protestant rights are built right into it, as they are in Belgium, I've heard. That Belgium, they have some other, you know, I heard there's this professor at Columbia called Richard Bullitt, and he was talking about Muslims in Europe and how, you know, there's different, you know, the integration and all that stuff. And he was talking about how in some countries, you know, they there's no, like in France, there's nothing. But he talked about how in Belgium, there's this thing where any group of religious people can go and petition to have their religion be subsidized in the school system in their, you know, and he said there were groups of Muslims that were getting like these kind of Islamist type classes that were being paid for by the Belgian state because that was in their constitution, you know, and it was very different. Like in France, that would never happen, right? They would never have, you know, they would never have Catholic or Protestant classes or anything in a French school because it's just a different mentality as in an American school as well. Typically, the religion is, you know, so that's something that I wonder if there's some crossover as well. But he seems to have grown up very conservative, very Catholic. And the other thing I wanted to note about him, just this goes back to your linguistic duality, is Belgium is a bilingual country. So there's two, and it's also a small country. So Hergé was aware very early on of two very important things. One, of the importance of getting his work translated immediately, right? He would have written it in Dutch, in French, and then he would have immediately needed to have it translated for the, you know, because they would I'm assuming, I don't know that, but I'm guessing.
Well, that's a really good question actually too. We should look into that for the next version. We should.
Well, it's quite clear that one of the things that always fascinates me about Tintin books is when you turn the page and it has the list of languages that it's right. You know when you go in and it says it's all in alphabetical order.
Oh yeah.
At the top and everything. Yeah. Right. I mean, I sort of geek out on that sometimes. Like, you know, why is there an English one published in Spain or something or whatever? Like, I'm sort of reading through it. So, like, that shows you that by the end of his career, he had aimed at the world, and he knew that language, getting it translated, was really important. And that must have been very early on. The other thing that must have happened very early on is that he must have known, as he was getting popular, that he had to break in the neighboring country of France to really make it in some.
Well, I mean, and that's what I was going to say about. Yeah, like we should look into this very question, because I sort of always assumed, partly because I did encounter him in French, I always assumed that he was like, this is that French kids around the world, this is their idol.
When you say French, you mean not Belgian, but French
speaking.
Right.
French speaking. So,
right. Okay.
So I think he was very successful in France very early on, but I'm not 100% sure. And then through France,
I'm almost certain about that. I mean, someone could fact check on that.
To the whole French speaking world. And I'm not sure when that we should look into that exact question about when did he become so international. Although the other thing, well, the one thing that I did read that I thought this is pretty important is with The Broken Ear, his fourth book, he said, I'm going to actually do some research on these folks, and he was renowned for spending months just before. So he wasn't just making it up.
Oh, not at all.
And so
meticulous.
It's interesting in The Broken Ear, the setting is somewhere in South America, in a couple made up countries in South America, and but the
San Theodoros,
San Theodoros
is the name of that
Rico,
country.
I think. And but the settings are so meticulous and just beautiful. And
that's a really important point, that he was so detail oriented, and he got more detail oriented as his career went on. Like in the later books, it's really, really tight. There's a little anecdote about that in one of the books, Prisoners of the Sun, I think it was, where he goes to first to Peru, and then he's in South America and all this stuff. And so I read somewhere, I forget where this was, but he was at, at this point, he was sort of well known. So he was at some sort of function, black tie thing in Brussels, whatever. And he was hobnobbing around, and there was the ambassador from Peru was there, or someone from the embassy or something, and said, "Oh, I read your book. It's beautiful," and complimenting him. And then he asked him, he said, when did you visit my country? Like, you must have, and Hergé was like, I've never been there. And then the guy was like, what, you've never been? Like, he couldn't believe it. He's like, that's crazy. He said, because it was perfect. The looks of the people and everything. And the guy, apparently, I don't know how this is known, but apparently the guy did not believe him, went back to the embassy and checked through the visa records to see.
Oh my God.
Apparently, like, he was like, that guy must have been to Peru. There's no way,
That's wild.
He would just dig through books and encyclopedias and kind of look at things and maps and stuff. He was just this incredible sort of, the level of detail in Tintin is
and I think that's also when he started to try, at least in the Broken Ear, like I said before, to try to tell a kind of a
coherent narrative.
Instead of just, I'd say, in
Tintin in America,
in the Soviets and Tintin Congo, it's just a bunch of crazy stuff that happens. And then in Tintin en Amérique, there is a bit of a more cohesive story, but it's sort of just because first he goes to Chicago, which is run by gangsters. And then he goes to out west, which is run by shoot 'em ups. Like,
and also it takes him this incredibly he goes out into the country from outside Chicago, and there's a cactus. Like, it's not geographically coherent. That doesn't make sense, right?
It doesn't.
It's totally
the great Midwest, the great state of Kansas has not entered Hergé's understanding of America. I would say it seemed to me completely based on
films,
crime novels and movies and comic strips, probably.
That makes sense. That I don't think he ever visited America. He didn't travel very much, from what I understand. He took a few trips around in Europe. He was in France for a while when the Nazis invaded, and then he went back to Belgium. Right. He was not a big traveler, which is. It makes me think that I think you mentioned something in one of our chats about this, about Tintin in America was sort of an exoticist. It was looking at America.
I mean, that was my first thought reading it, actually. I mean, I had just reread Congo, or, flipped through Congo and thought, man, the stereotypes are so thick here. And it's, I know that he's good-hearted. And he's not trying to put anybody down, but man. And then I go to Amérique, and yes, there's some native people who are stereotyped, but mostly it's the white man is stereotyped.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody's stereotyped.
Exactly.
In that book.
And I think I really do think, especially as he started to do some serious research, I think he really opened up to other people, and he really tried not to stereotype. And he
definitely.
And I mean, he wanted. It was very the ethnic dress was very important to him. It's kind of situate, and I think he definitely. I mean, he ends up sending Tintin to the moon. Like he wants it to be exciting and different. Not just the same thing. I don't think Tintin ever. No, I'm exaggerating there too. But mostly they're set in other countries. If I'm not mistaken.
Mostly they're what?
Set in other countries, if I'm not mistaken.
That's true. Most of the stories are, in fact, probably over half are outside Europe. At least, right? And then within Europe, he's a few different places. He's in the UK and the Black Island, and he's in Belgium and in the. There's one episode that takes place entirely at Marlin Spike, with Bianca Castafiore and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of a unique book, the Castafiore's Emerald. Yeah, but he doesn't spend a lot of time in Europe, really. And it's very much an exoticist. It's interesting because the images in America. The other interesting thing about Tintin in America is it's the only book that has a real world person who's a villain. Al Capone has a very brief appearance.
That's right.
He's not the main villain. It's interesting. He shows up at he's like, hey, screw you or whatever. He's kind of there. And then Tintin spends the rest of the book chasing this other guy called Bobby Smiles or whatever.
Yeah, right? there's like a conspiracy in the mob to dethrone Al Capone, and they're the ones.
That's right. They're the ones he's going after. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, which is really
weird. Interesting. I had not thought about that. That's kind of
interesting. You should mention that because
mostly he would not in like actual politicians are not named.
No politicians are named. I mean, if there are names, they're invented names. I mean, there's very interesting stereotypes of America. You're right. I mean, there's the Indians, and there's also at one point that struck me, because I just read it today, was that the train's going along, and Tintin's lying on the tracks or something, and so he's going to run over by the train, and the train stops, and it turns out that a sort of an elderly looking woman had pulled the brake, and she's like this kind of Puritan do-gooder who says, "Oh, I saw a puma attacking a deer. I'm from the internet. I'm from the National Association for Animal Protection or something." All this, and which is sort of a funny stereotype of a sort of an American Puritanism in a certain way, right?
Yeah, that's interesting too. Yeah,
it was one thing that struck me today, because I wouldn't have noticed that as a child, right?
No, but the other thing I wanted to mention is that going from America to the Broken Ear is that Broken Ear is a lot more coherent as far as a story goes, but still there's so much insane random stuff happening,
right?
And I think that if I'm not mistaken, a little bit of that goes on all the time, because
that's true.
You do have to have cliffhangers. You do have to have.
Well, the part of Tintin
is in a lot of fights,
Well, just something important about what you're saying, I just want to mention quickly, is part of the beauty of Tintin is just the beautiful slapstick comedy that gets, especially as Captain Haddock comes in and becomes this incredibly hilarious person who's constantly, tripping over things and getting angry and all this kind of stuff. Haddock is not there for the first part of Tintin. Another thing I read once was that if you read those early books, including The Broken Ear, I believe, I can't remember, Tintin in America is like this. Tintin talks to his dog Snowy. He has conversations with him.
They have conversations,
right? And he doesn't do that in the later books. And I there's one theory that Haddock may have kind of replaced Snowy as his.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's kind of crazy when they're actually
when they're having a conversation. Yeah, it's kind of weird. And Snowy's answering him. It's like what?
And mostly Snowy is just providing comic relief, But
most of the time, and he's supportive of Tintin, right?
Every once in a while, he'll like relay a piece of information,
right? Yeah, which is really weird. In America, he's like telling him things. It's like what? How does that work exactly? Yeah. No, it's also another thing. A book I read a long time ago pointed out the similarities between Snowy and Haddock. They're both also prone to alcohol. Snowy very often.
He loves to get.
He accidentally, like, someone will put a glass down and he gets all drunk and he's staggering around. just like Haddock, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was conscious.
It's interesting too, because especially in these early books, Tintin has a way of being slipped something, or he gets accidentally high or drunk.
True. Yeah, so it's almost like talking to you about it. It's almost like Hergé had all of the characters were in Tintin, and as it went through, and there was Snowy, and then you have Haddock, and then eventually Calculus. You have these different facets of Tintin's meticulous personality versus his comic personality versus I think that's what may have been happening as he created those other characters. Way of putting it.
I also started noticing, and I don't think I ever did read them chronologically like this, that there's kind of a proto Calculus and a proto. Actually, I saw a couple proto Haddocks. A couple people looked like him. And
interesting.
So it's like
So he was developing the idea somehow visually as well, right? I don't remember. That's in Tintin and the Broken Ear. There's one character in Tintin in America who looks a bit like Haddock. He's got the same kind of big nose. He's one of the gangsters. Kind of looks like him. Maybe you're referring to him. Yeah, that's interesting. So this period, as you've got from 1929 up through to World War II, you see, this is why I chose this. It's as the first episode is. It's kind of the germination. By the time you get to kind of like, I'm thinking Red Rackham's Treasure is when. Calculus is entered, right? That's kind of like the main characters are now there, basically. Like the recurring cast, let's say, who come through, because Thompson and Thompson are very early on. They come in.
They're in the Blue Lotus, actually.
Which is really early, right? The theory about Thompson and Thompson, because I mean they're such a hilarious. I mean they're just. it's just such incredible comic relief. These identical twins who are these serious policemen who are so stupid. They're both, each one's stupider than the next, right? It's just like, it's incredible how, and they're like these, like, kind of like Interpol high level detect. Like, it's not like they're like low level cops, right? Like, how that's a joke right there, right?
They're detectives.
The theory, because that's kind of a joke on the institutional, because Tintin's not inside the police bureaucracy, but he's always solving the thing for them, right? They're always kind of.
He's supposedly a reporter.
Right, supposedly, yeah, exactly, yeah. That's his profession, which of course he almost never exercises. I think I read once that he filed one report. There's one. I think it's in the Shooting Star, where there's one case where there's like a newspaper report and it says by Tintin. I forget which book it is, but it's like out of all 24 books, that's dozens of little adventures he's involved in. He actually has one, But the theory I heard about Thompson and Thompson was that it's a joke about how government bureaucracy is, first of all, stupid, but also duplicated stupid, right? Like there's two of them that are identical, but they're not quite identical. Thompson with a P, as in Philadelphia or whatever.
That's why when you said identical twins, no.
Their mustaches are a little bit different, right?
And they're doppelgangers. They're not even related. One has a P and the other one doesn't have a P.
Right.
They're not even related.
That's true.
And they're originally in French, they're Dupont
and Dupont
with the T and a D, and that's even better. It's like
I know. Like, how would it? No one can, because the Thompson, I suppose you could say Thompson, I don't know. But they always say that with a P is in Philadelphia. Like, what the hell? It's like, what does that even mean? Right?
They are great, and they're, I got to reread a few in French again too, because basically one of them says something very trite.
Right.
And then the next one screws up the cliche.
Yes.
And that's the humor. It's like
they get it backwards or something. Yeah. And then they start talking with each other to try and fix it, which is sort of more like, because they're sort of confusing each other, right?
Yeah.
It's like, and they're a good example of, I just wanted to say that just back to the slapstick comedy, because they're always sort of constantly sort of also physically kind of, doing stupid things. There's one where he's holding a magnifying glass and it starts his pants on fire, just like dumb little.
There's a whole big thing in I don't know which one, the Blue Lotus, I think, where they're falling down, breaking their noses.
Right.
Up in the hospital.
Yeah. So that's really in the germination phase. And there's, again, the very conservative. This brings us into, I think, some of the political things in Tintin, right? You mentioned the Blue Lotus. That was based, actually on events that were happening in China at that time, apparently.
Right.
There's when they when at one point one of the railroads is blown up somewhere in China. Apparently that really happened, and it was a false flag thing. The Japanese whatever somehow staged it and all this stuff.
Yeah, and his sympathies are pretty clear in that book, that he's with the Chinese against.
Definitely, yes, yeah. Well, he seems to be. If we had to explain what Hergé's political views is, and I wanted to run this by you as an idea. He seems to be clearly a conservative, a small c conservative, who kind of believes in kind of the ordered nature of things. Even in Tintin in America, I noticed that
for sure. I think
he's being feted by like all the local, like these American, and they're all dressed up and wearing their bow ties, and that's juxtaposed with the gangster convention where they're all kind of like rowdy and sort of like smoking and kind of.
For sure. There's a whole there's a very old school
law and order, stability, conservative
European critique of America.
That's
from
true.
A very conservative point of view. And I'd say that he's totally playing into that. It's like they're crazy over there. It's lawless and normal human behavior is.
It's just before I come back to the conservative point I want to get to. I wanted to tell you something about that. The United States is an interesting society because if you look at, like, if you think about the developed world and then the developing world, so you have like, Sweden or the United Kingdom or something are developed, Canada, and then you have like Brazil or Nigeria or something like that. So those are clearly defined. The United States kind of seems, my brother made this point once, kind of seems in between that in a lot of ways. Like it has a lot of features of developing the dynamism. You know, when you go to some place in the Caribbean, some developing country,
which I've never been to, but
okay. Well, I mean, some like in the Dominican Republic, there's people on the streets selling things, and there's all this kind of action. You don't see that so much in European and Canada, whereas you do see that in the US and a lot. Like you see that kind of, and also it's a more violent place than the so-called developed world. It's got very much a kind of a take care of yourself ethic, which many, you know, like in my wife's country, like people have guns in their houses for protection. It's the same idea, right? It's like, this is my house. If someone comes in, I'm going to shoot them. You know, it's like, you know, and so I wonder if when he's looking at America this way, he's kind of seeing it like a developing country, I think.
Yeah, I think in a way, yes, but in another way, I think he's basically a victim of mass media at that point.
Right.
He has a very superficial understanding of America. You really have to appreciate its complexity a little bit more than that. I'd say it's. I mean, I don't.
I think that's a fair point. It does seem. I mean, it is cartoonish. I mean, literally cartoonish in that particular book. I also I want to get back to some of the stereotypes in a minute, but just to continue with this conservative thing. So he seems to be very much a small c conservative. He believes, probably a monarchist. I mean, I don't know this, but he probably believed in that, right? You know, in the sense of the stability of a monarchy rather than a republican system. And what struck me, you know, in knowing about what happened to him with the Nazis is, he was clearly a conservative, but he was totally not a fascist, right? And what is interesting, how I think a lot of modern people think fascism and conservatism are sort of similar, or at least on the same. And I don't think they are. I think they're really different. I wanted to hear what you thought about that.
Well, I don't want to declare a grand theory of fascism, but no, it's not. It's not a conservative movement. It's reactionary, but it's not. They don't actually.
It's also very romantic. It's very romantic.
Not really small c conservative, because they're not out to conserve. They want. They actually want a revolution, but into whatever this grand new world reactionary utopia that's set in a completely imagined past, and they're not interested in conserving. You know, what is actually around
what them. Actually is around that came from the past. What actually is the heritage of the past. That would be the distinguishing thing between conservatism and fascism, is they both look back in some senses. But the conservative looks back and says, well, okay, it's looked simultaneously now and backwards, and says, well, if something exists now, then there must be a reason for it. Right. It's not here by accident. The fascist does not do. The fascist is more like a communist or
in so many ways. I mean, and I don't want to. This is a huge topic that I don't really want to.
I know.
Align, I mean, there is a reason why the word socialist is in the name National Socialist. And we know that Mussolini was a socialist before he invented fascism. In a lot of ways, I would say it's all a reaction against the success of the Bolsheviks in Russia. It's a kind of there's a fear reaction, but there's also an emulation reaction. And
there's also the notion, like conservatism is still, I think it understands the individual as being a sort of sacred thing. I think conservatives understand that, as perhaps liberals do as well, right? Whereas fascists and communists, they don't, like, if you're a true fascist or a true communist, you're not really you. You're just an avatar for the great thing. And I'm we're all just in the service of this thing.
The state is more important.
Sorry, I interrupted you, but
No, that's fine. That's fine. But I think that's as much as I want to say.
I don't mean to get stuck on it, but because it's so striking when you read the intense anti-communism in Land of Soviets.
But I would say, yes, it's intensely anti-communist, and the funny thing for me, to go back to my autobiography, is that I got this book. I was flabbergasted when I opened it a few years ago, to see that I could still sort of make out the price of the book.
How much was it?
It was about $40.
Wow.
In 1973,
wow,
which is a hell of a lot of money.
Expensive, yeah,
for sure. It was a very nice gift for my dad to get me for Christmas.
Nice.
But yeah,
that's a touching
at the university bookstore where I went on to work for 20 years and all that kind of stuff. But the thing is, so 1973 was when I turned 11, and by the time I was 12, I was a diehard small C communist.
Yeah.
I didn't revere the Soviet Union, and I hated Stalin, and I didn't like Mao, and I didn't, I hated the Soviet Union, but I identified as a small C communist. I had read the Communist Manifesto and had turned into a small C communist. And I remained a small C communist for many, many years thereafter. And I just wondered, like, why didn't this book save me from that?
It's a good question. Yeah.
But I mean, the main thing about being a small C communist is that you're one of these people who goes around saying about the Soviet Union, oh, that's not real communism.
Right, yeah.
And you think that is basically, that absolves you of further thought or comment on the matter.
Right. I mean, I've heard you say this about yourself, that you were I've heard you say, I mean, yeah. I think I know myself, I was much further left wing when I was younger. I never had, I don't consider myself to be any particular ideology. And I'm very loath to call myself a conservative because I love the idea of things changing. I'm very much into I'm very open, and I believe in kind of like, But it's one thing that I think you and I both have realized as we've grown older is that the idea that the government intervening and creating some sort of, sort of family-like utopia among the population is probably the worst idea in human history, right?
It's pretty much up there for sure.
Yeah, the evidence for that is pretty strong.
But I do have to say about it. Not that, that was a whole digression.
That's okay. No, it's good.
I would say it is extremely anti-Soviet, but then I also would say that King Ottokar's scepter is,
I was just going to get to that. Yeah.
Very anti-fascist.
It's so obviously anti. It's not even hidden. Monsieur is the name of the Bordurian president or whatever he is, who's trying to overthrow the neighboring country. And again, you've got a monarchy that's being overthrown. You know what I mean? And Tintin comes in and saves the established monarchy from this kind of like this fascist. It's really a fascist overthrow. It's obviously something about the Anschluss. I think. Oh,
for sure. Yeah, it's exactly the Anschluss and then the Sudetenland. And I was looking at the numbers. Of course, I don't really have a.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to say so our listeners are not too confused. They're not too Tintin fanatic. Okay. The story is there's two fictitious countries in Eastern Europe. One called Sildavia, and the other one called Borduria. And they've been enemies for centuries, going back to the Middle Ages and everything. And in Sildavia, there's a king, a monarch who has a scepter who the man who fought off the Bordurians in the 13th century, so the king has to have the scepter or else he can't be king. And so there's a very complex plot by Bordurian fascists to infiltrate and steal the scepter. It's a very complicated, people can read it. And Tintin comes in, and again, you've got a monarchy, a stable monarchical system, and then you've got a neighbor that has this new, more aggressive kind of political system, right? Which sort of fascist, and it's very, very clearly, it seems to be almost Sudetenland and Anschluss and Poland.
It's interesting about the visuals of the King Ottokar scepter, the book, which is one of my favorites.
It's amazing, even though it doesn't have Attic, it's still absolutely amazing.
You did actually ask me what's your favorite, and I mentioned that at top 2, I'd say. And it's interesting because the kingdom of
Sildavia,
I think I called it Sildavie, but has a very medieval aesthetic, which really has always very much appealed to me. I don't know what I mean. It's interesting because I'm not a Tolkien fanatic, thank God. but I am a Tintin fanatic. But I really, the Middle Ages really appealed to me, and then up against that is this modernist fascist aesthetic of Borduria, which is just terrifying. There's nothing appealing about it at all. It's just like
it's interesting because first of all, I just want to reinforce your notion that King Ottokar's Scepter was also a very brave book to write, because in some sense, if you think about what was going on at that, he was openly saying, I don't know if there must have been fascists in Belgium. I mean,
for sure there were.
You know what I mean? It's like, so it's kind of like he was really sticking his neck out. The other interesting thing about it is Hergé it's so strange. He lost his job because the 7e had to close down, or whatever, and then Le Soir opened up or something. And so anyway, so he got another job during the war, and he worked all through the war. And during the war, he stopped. I think I may have mentioned this earlier, but he stopped doing political stories, and he did like, you have like the treasure hunt in the Caribbean, Red Rackham's treasure. On Wikipedia it said something like he went from reporter to explorer. He kind of like
that's a good way to put it.
Right,
but except that I never believed that he was a reporter.
Right. Well, as we were saying a minute ago, right? Yeah. But what's interesting is that just back to Hergé as a person. So after the war, he was arrested as a collaborator, and actually spent a couple of nights, a night or two in prison, and he was denounced publicly and all this stuff. And I remember reading about this, about how he was denounced and all this, and I thought, did these fucking people ever read King Ottokar's Scepter? Like, did they how could you imagine a person who would write that book would be pro-Nazi? That's just like, you'd have to be thick,
they were just mad at him because he worked through the war. And I can kind of understand that, except also it's like, what are you going to do? You have to
live,
right?
You got to survive.
And I mean, it's interesting too, in a strange way, maybe. I mean, I don't know what other people's faves are or anything like that, but yeah, King Ottokar's Scepter, and the one before that, the Black Island,
set in Scotland,
the aesthetic of that is just so
dark,
amazing. Just amazing. The caves and the cliffs and the mountains, and the Scottish countryside.
And it's beautiful.
It's amazing. And has a total
visually. Hergé was a real genius artist. I think that's what you're referring to, right? It's just the drawing.
But I guess what I'm saying is those the books that you're talking about, Red Rackham's Treasure and The Secret of the Unicorn, I think are the ones that really probably launched his worldwide appeal as well. So it's
interesting.
It's kind of taking a step back from being a reporter and trying to mirror the political adventures. Obviously, you have to be more circumspect when you're living in a totalitarian,
Nazi-dominated country. Right.
So to then move into a more lighthearted adventure, I'm sorry, it just makes sense. But it also means that your appeal is going to be even broader, because basically people are you get to project yourself onto Tintin, I suppose, is what we were doing, and live this exciting
it's a vicarious thing, right? As a kid, I mean, I'm sure you did this, I'm sure every boy did this, you reading Tintin, like, I want to be that guy going, it actually formed part of, in some senses, like when I got older, I wanted to go live in other parts of the world. I wanted to travel, and I think some of that was, I mean, my family, we traveled a fair bit, but I eventually went and lived in Slovakia.
Oh my!
For about a year, and I also lived in East Asia for 3 years, and so I did
a lot of traveling. I knew about the East Asia.
But just back to the you mentioned the medieval thing about it's very interesting. If it's true, like the further east you go in Europe, like if you go to Romania, I was in Romania once, and the train got rerouted. I was in Transylvania, literally in Transylvania, and the train got rerouted. Somehow there were floods, and so we're up there in this, and you going through the train was going very slowly through very small villages, and this was in about 2005, something like that. You literally see people wearing, like, it looks like it's 100 years ago. They're wearing these kind of like traditional sort of folklore. I remember thinking, is there some sort of folklore festival going on? Like what, there's sort of horse-drawn carts, people using hand sickles out in the field, cutting things down and all this, and gypsies, like literal gypsies wearing different kinds of clothes. It's like, and that was a real experience. Like, because that's really, I mean, Slovakia's, look practically modern compared to that. What I mean? But just to say, to get back to your Soldavia thing, Soldavia seems to be some sort of like many of the fictional countries. I had something I prepared about that. They seem to be sort of mixtures of different things. So it seems to be part Sudetenland, part Romania, part Czechoslovakia, like it's kind of like a few different things somehow. I think maybe like Bulgaria, because it mentions the Turks in one right. So it could be something that, I don't know. I don't think the Turks were ever in Sudetenland or anything.
Definitely not. No,
right. So that's something I wanted to echo. But just a quick thing that occurred to me while we were talking was, is it possible that Hergé was sitting there, because I think he published King Ottokar's Scepter in 1937. You think he was sitting there in Belgium and was sort of creating an, oh my God, I'm terrified of my neighbor, kind of like the large Germany next door. I want to maintain the monarchy of my sacred country. I'm a conservative. There's this country next to mine which has a fascist dictator that's literally plotting against other countries. So I don't know if that, maybe his fears were being.
I think probably for sure, and also, like you say, taking a stand against it. And
that's true.
Which obviously if people were taking stands against it consistently through the 30s, of people of various kinds. But there's always there is this sense, of course, that it's far right. And so then
you mean the fascists, the Nazis?
Fascism is the far right. And so then the near right, or the moderate
conservative, is sort of adjacent.
They do have to define themselves against it. One of the scary things about the United States right now is that the moderate Republicans, if they exist at all, are not defining themselves against the kind of more.
The United States is a little more complex because of because it doesn't have a monarchy. So I don't want to linger too long on the U.S. because it's a bit too complicated. But one of the things Jordan Peterson mentioned recently on the passing of the Queen was how he recounted an experience, how he was in Nashville and how Trump showed up. I don't know if you heard that. And he was like, and there was this buzz and everything. And he said, it's not healthy to have a person, like it's healthier to have someone who's clearly the king of the country or whatever. Not, you can't go and choose that person. This is not a good situation.
I've come to some kind of realization like that
about the monarchy.
For certainly when I was a small C communist, but even afterwards, I was kind of a I don't know what exactly to call
socialist,
but I remained a socialist, social democrat. I certainly was. I fetishized this idea of direct democracy as if that was going to solve everything. Which I've come to realize, no, not really.
It might make things worse.
It might make things worse. But for sure, there seems to be that. Not seems to be. There is a large element of the irrational in human nature, and to pretend that there isn't is dangerous. And I think part of the desacralization of the world is this idea that we can make it run rationally and without any nonsense. And
it's sort of the Sam Harris, Steven Pinker view.
I think so.
If you just use rationality, then people
it's
will
funny
just
too.
be
I
rational.
also identify it very strongly with Noam Chomsky's aversion against sports. It's like he's always going on about it, sports, what a waste of time it is, and how if people would only apply the brain power that they use it for sports to something like politics, the world would be a better place. And
I'm not sure that's true. Yeah,
no, not at all.
I think it's absolutely wrong.
I think sports is wonderful.
It's probably a good outlet for people.
It's wonderful because you can have this irrational identification and this tribe mentality.
Totally.
Where with I mean, aside from some soccer hooliganism,
it almost has no damage on the world. Exactly. And yet people can do exactly as you say. They can have this totally natural sense of, I am part of this group, and these are my people, and we're going to go beat this other group, and have almost no violent victims as a result of that. It's just Chomsky is completely opposite. It's an anti-truth what he's saying.
I think so too, but it's related to the question of the monarchy, and it is. I mean, in a way, the way that you put it about conservatives, and this is, I guess, the Burkean ideal of conservatism, which hardly any real life conservatives ever actually live up to. But the Burkean ideal is, let's get rid of it. Let's figure out what
it might serve some purpose. It might actually serve. Maybe we should try and change its function.
Right now we're about to find out what happens when
here in Canada. You mean with the monarchy?
Obviously, the Queen was a singular individual, and Prince.
He is not.
Charles is not the same individual. So we'll find out whether the institution of the monarchy is actually still strong enough. But I mean, one of the things about it is, somebody pointed out, the monarchy has really served the British people well since about 1936, and that's true. Like I don't know a lot of details about the kings before Edward.
There was a kind of a crisis throughout the 20th century
about Edward because he was not suited to the monarchy. And fortunately he stepped down. But I guess the other people between Victoria and him were not all that impressive. But you know what? If it hadn't been for that institution, Elizabeth would never have been delivered to Britain.
That's true.
And it's because of that institution that they got Elizabeth, and she's remarkable.
She was remarkable. Yeah, it's interesting. It's also the other thing I wanted to return to, this idea of conservatism. Winston Churchill bragged that he saved freedom for the world. He actually, and so conservatism has a long connection with the concept of individual freedom that I think for people like in your generation and maybe in mine, coming up in Canada, conservatism when I was growing up, and it still kind of feels to me this way, is almost like a dirty word. You don't want to be a conservative. It's like, those are the stodgy old people.
Let me tell you this,
and yet it's like, well, what is so wrong with the idea that you're an individual and you can be free, and that should be something good? I mean,
but let me just say this, Jason, before we got to get back to Hergé, but let me.
I know we will. Yeah, but it actually does connect. Actually,
I took a test online, and I got classical liberal, and I'm happy with that, and I'm sick with it. So I don't have to defend conservatism, although I do understand the ideal of conservatism, and I can appreciate that. And I myself, I grew up in a very I would say very small C. We didn't talk about politics at all in my house.
Really? Interesting.
But very Catholic home. And that was certainly one of the appeals of
I grew up
probably one of the appeals of the Middle Ages.
I grew up in a totally opposite, very, very left-wing hippie parents, sort of like total Trudeau liberal type parents. But just to close the thought on classical liberals, I actually created a group of friends that there's a bunch of us, and we all, Mike Guetta, Mike Guetta.
I know Mike Guetta.
Mike Guetta's in that group.
No, I actually met him. I met Mike. He's a great guy.
Yeah, and Sid Parkinson and Serge, we met, and a bunch of us, and we go and we hang out together. And the name of the group is Clowns, Classical Liberals Opposed to Western Neo-Socialism, right? And it's just an excuse for a bunch of dudes to get together and drink beer, and and you're invited if you want. If ever you're in Montreal, you're invited.
If I ever make it, I will make it up there. But
okay, all right. So back to Tintin. I think that in many respects, Hergé, being a conservative, is closer to what you and I would consider a classical liberal, in the sense that he was looking around at Europe, and he was seeing fascism and communism, and then what was the other option? Was this kind of thing, well, okay, keep the thing we have, which is this sort of Enlightenment liberalism and the monarchy. I mean, he also had quote unquote conservative views as well that maybe some classical liberals may not have endorsed. Like, many classical liberals would not have wanted a monarchy.
That's very true, and that actually just occurred to me here, having just spouted all this pro-monarchism.
You're a Republican.
That does not
small
really,
R Republican.
I would hope to be and the total got nothing to do with Hergé, but one of the things about small R republicanism is that the British have a very long history of it. I mean, for one thing, they actually did get rid of their monarch.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I was just thinking about was that I'm not 100% sure why I was thinking about this, but I was thinking their national epic, as it were, is Paradise Lost. It was written by John Milton, who was a very anti-monarchist, so much so.
Interesting.
First.
Could you repeat that? Just because it bugged for a second. John Milton
wrote Paradise Lost, which has been, I'd say, maybe the third most popular book in the English language, after the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress.
Interesting.
Was in like houses that didn't have any books, had those three books.
Wow.
And
this is in the United Kingdom. It was
in the United Kingdom.
Yeah,
it is. Right. That's why I say it's the national epic of the British. And he himself was a defender of the Republic and of the execution of the king.
Wow.
He wrote the defense of the execution of the king. So this part of somehow or other is melded into the British.
It is, yeah.
Politics and personality, and I think they have a Republican monarchy.
Yeah. Well, it's quite clear. I mean, the monarchy has not had that much political power for quite a long time. And it's quite clear that they have, the United Kingdom and Canada as well. And I think that we should recognize, I mean, we don't have to necessarily be proud of the monarchy or the British, but we do have a pretty good and pretty stable country and democracy. Generally, we have had for quite a long time. And is it a coincidence that we are inheritors of is that just a coincidence, or is there something about that system and using that system over a long time, carefully?
Yeah.
I think it is. I would not go too far in I don't believe in the monarchy for Canada either, but if there's a choice between, sort of burning the system down and building a republic or keeping what we have, I think I would keep what we have.
I mean, I was, people have been opining about this for a few days now, and
we're recording this not long after Queen Elizabeth passed away.
That's right.
About a week
so
after.
The main thing that I said was, we can consider another system, but let's not have the American system or the French system or the German system or the Italian system. So I
wouldn't mind having the governor general be an elected post of some kind. Like if there's some way that if I could elect the governor general, it could still be connected to the monarchy in some way. I don't have a problem. It could be the monarchy could somehow, there could be some choosing of a few candidates or something, and I don't know, But here's one final thought about.
Okay, go for it.
But back to the idea of stability in Canada and Belgium, and Canada and Belgium are both fragile countries. I mean, just to close the thought, opening up the Constitution to change our system of government, what could go wrong? It's not like that ever caused any trouble in this country. Last time we did that in the 80s and the 90s, it nearly blew the country apart, literally. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, we came this far away. I was there on St. Catherine Street when the riots were going on after the referendum in 95. I mean, this is something that marked me when I was a young person.
No, and it's interesting too, and I wish can't remember the title of the book. I didn't read it, but I read a very good review of it, and it's basically saying nobody had a clue or a plan for what would happen if they had won that referendum. The PQ didn't know what they were going to do, and the
federal people,
no idea what
Federalists had no plan.
Either. And it's wild to think of that. It kind of reminds me of what happened with Brexit in the UK. It's like I don't think the Brexiteers were ready to win, and certainly the Remainers were not willing ready.
But if they had won, I mean, if the yes side had won, it would have had to have been respected in some senses. Even you know what I mean? Because it would have, delegitimized everything if it had been 51%, right?
No, for sure. If the yes side had won, something would have had to happen for sure.
Some major change of some kind. The other thing that, just because I don't want to get too stuck on Canadian politics, but Chantal Hébert wrote an interesting book about how it turned the three leaders of the yes side, those who were in favor of sovereignty, Mario Dumont, Jacques Parizeau, and Lucien Bouchard, had three totally different ideas of what it was going to mean. You know what I mean? Exactly. The Federalist side, it was kind of obvious. We just keep going on doing what we're doing. Quebec is a part of Canada, and it just stays that way. But it turns out that Parizeau was really the only true sovereignist, separatist, like really full on. He was and he apparently stopped taking the calls of Lucien Bouchard at the end. He saw that it looked like it was going to win. He was like, screw you guys, you've done your job, and I'm going to go and...
wild.
Yeah, and then he got drunk, and he was all ready to celebrate, and then it turned out it wasn't, and he made this horrible comment about the immigrants, le vote ethnique. Le vote ethnique, l'argent, le vote ethnique, which is a notorious thing, So anyway, but just to say that Canada and Belgium are both fragile countries, and maybe there's something about that connection to the monarchy that might help that stability. I don't know.
I bet you Hergé thought so.
Yeah, he definitely did. Yeah.
But this brings up the other autobiographical bit that I have to talk about. It's kind of It's kind of insane. It's kind of very unique. Okay, so, and it's in a way, it's strangely related because if you can remember, and maybe you can't remember yourself, all the way back to the 70s and early 80s, before the Bloc Québécois was formed as a separatist party on the national level, people who really believed in Quebec independence had nobody to vote for in the
federally. Yeah, so that's right. I do remember that. I remember the formation of the BQ. Yeah, go ahead.
Probably very poor turnout. I'm not really sure, but also as a result of that discontent with Canada, it allowed for the rise of the most powerful joke party, I think, in the history of the world, the Rhinoceros Party of Canada.
Wow. Is that what led to it? It started in Quebec?
It started in Quebec.
Wow,
for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it did very well in Quebec
in the 70s and 80s.
Of 1980.
Wow,
especially.
Interesting. The first referendum,
right. And exactly in the aftermath of the first referendum and before the formation of the BQ, so the Parti Québécois, not Parti Québec, Parti Rhinoceros Party started to get all this press. And I, as a young small c communist and capital A absurdist, thought this is absolutely excellent. Let me join. Let me run for them. Except that in 1980, I was not yet of age. I was only 17. I couldn't run in the election. So I had I still have an excellent friend who's an anarchist, small a, capital A, whatever, named Len Wallace, and he became my my press officer, my campaign what's it called?
Campaign manager. Yeah.
And he was incredible. He had a lot of connections in the press, and he got me on the radio, on the biggest talk radio in Windsor, CKWW. And I was on a phone-in show talking about my write-in campaign at that point. I was running under the name of Martin X, and I wanted Martin X. I wanted people to write.
Name. Sort of Malcolm X kind of a feel to it.
Right? To be honest, it hadn't even occurred to me.
Right.
I was just like, I didn't want to run under my
your
real
family name.
So I just said Martin X, and I appeared in public only with a bag over my head, but I got to be on the radio, and so I got to be on the radio, and during this call-in show. Oh, I've already jumped ahead. The thing about the Rhinoceros Party is that they had many, many nonsensical platforms. The best one was, we're going to change from driving on the right-hand side of the road, driving on the left-hand side. but it's going to be phased in. We're going to go trucks first. And here in Windsor, my plank was, we're going to tear down the Ambassador Bridge, the bridge between Detroit and Windsor, and we're going to pave the river so that people can drive over at any point. Anyway,
oh man.
So
Great.
One of the planks of the Rhinoceros Party was based on Tintin au Congo.
Okay.
Because in Tintin au Congo, one of the insane adventures, unexplained adventures,
he blows up a rhinoceros.
He blows up a rhinoceros
with a stick of dynamite. It's the craziest thing. It's the weirdest thing.
So the Rhinoceros Party said they claimed that the leader of the party was a rhinoceros named Cornelius who lived in the Vancouver Zoo, and they claimed that the rhinoceros that Tintin blew up was a martyr. A cousin of Cornelius, and it was taken as a personal insult by Cornelius. And as a result, and this is what they promised: if the Rhinoceros Party won the election, Canada would declare war on Belgium. So that was
that is so hilarious, right?
One of the planks in the platform. So I'm on the radio, and I get this call, and I actually recognize the person's voice. She was the perennial candidate for the Communist Party of Canada, Marxist-Leninist, the Maoist party. And she was complaining. She was complaining about my name. She thought that Martin X was, she didn't use the word appropriation because that wasn't around in those days. I was appropriating Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And I'm like, no, not really, not at all. But then she started really going on about this declaring war on Belgium. And she's like, might seem funny to you, but it's not a joke to the people of Belgium. They've been overrun twice in this century. And you're going to declare war against them because of a comic book. And I was just flabbergasted by this. I have no idea what I said back.
Was she seriously, or is this one of these fake questions?
Well, it was fake.
Is she pretending to be outraged?
No, definitely she was pretending to be outraged, but it was just hilarious. And then at the very same time, the news broke that the Belgian ambassador to Canada had invited the members of the Rhinoceros Party to the embassy, had given them a case of beer like they demanded, had fed them some fine food, and had come to terms of peace between the Rhinoceros Party of Canada and the country of Belgium. Gosh. And that
is wild, man. That is.
I have somewhere around here. I just saw it recently. I have a printout from the Newswire, basically saying we've come to terms.
That is so wild.
It's a real story. It got reported in the New York Times, among other places. And anyway, the main thing is, yes, Tintin he becomes much more responsible and only fights bad guys eventually. But in these early books, he is a wild card. And he's an incredible fighter too, by the way. That has to be mentioned.
Tough guy, in many respects.
Very tough guy.
Yeah.
I think it's in Tintin in America. It's in Blue Lotus. They send 3 big tough guys in to beat him up. He puts them all.
Beats the crap out of all of them. Yeah. No, it's what you were saying. This is something I think we're going to get into more in the second podcast about the racism versus not.
Right.
Because if to me, if you look at Tintin in the Congo, it's maybe the Blue Lotus. It's sort of like, this is obviously a sort of a racist caricature of Africans.
It's based on it, right? For sure.
I mean, they were written in the early 30s, and they're, at this point, Hergé was what, like 22, 20, he was very young.
Right.
And we forget that think of how racist the world was 100
for sure.
Ago. You know what I mean? And in a place like Western Europe, that their views of what a Congolese person would have been like, and that's not to excuse those views, but to put them into some kind of a context. Yeah. One final thing I just want to say about that is, when I read Tintin, I never read Tintin in the Congo as a kid because it wasn't translated into English. It was and all this. So I read it as an adult, and very often some of the books have kind of like the earlier ones have sort of trigger warnings, explanations. The Blue Lotus does, so does the Congo. And one of them I read was this sort of thing. Well, the representation was Tintin in the Congo, and there was a kind of a trigger warning in the,
right.
And it said something like, the representations are very, it was done in the 1930s and blah, blah, blah. It's not meant to be taken seriously and so on. But what was really weird was some of the editions took out that rhinoceros scene as
I wouldn't be surprised because
it's but not the anti-black racism.
No, it's funny
weird,
too. It's funny too though, because it is. I was talking about some of the randomness in one of the strips that
just to be clear, just so our listeners understand, Tintin is involved in some sort of a conflict, and so there's a rhinoceros that's going to kill him.
I wouldn't say so. No.
Well, somehow he has a stick of dynamite and
the stick of dynamite.
Head, right.
One of the thing about it that's disturbing, and why they would remove it, is that it's completely unmotivated.
Right.
Like, and it's not what he doesn't go around blowing things up. He doesn't go around blowing up animals. Like, who blows up animals?
Yeah.
So I think that's probably why it would be removed. I haven't seen that. I noticed that
the edition I read. I'm not sure because I think the edition I read had it in it. But I remember reading somewhere that maybe some editions they took it out. Or maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong about that. But I do know that was clearly stated as probably one of the worst things in the trigger warning too. Like, this is a really horrible thing. Very not anti-animal. I don't know how to think about it. Just
I don't know. It is
uselessly violent towards animals.
Exactly. I just wanted to mention one of the because I think actually we should probably wrap up. I know you're the host, but we do have.
I know. Don't worry. I don't have much more to go through. I know because we're basically getting close to wrapping. So,
but I just wanted to mention the one I actually made a note of it. It was so insane in The Broken Ear. He's stuck in this cabin. The bad guys have him. They have their guns pointed at him. I think they just said to him. I think they said, where is the idol? Mm-hmm. And he told them. Or he told them where he said it was. And then they said, well, now we don't need you anymore. So we're going to kill you. Yeah. And the cabin is struck by lightning, and a ball of lightning ejects Tintin from the cabin, and he wakes up on the road, and they wake up. Where's Tintin? That's how crazy stuff happens.
Some of the things are like that are so crazy. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that. In Tintin in America, there's an explosion. He's driving a runaway train, and there's an old guy crossing the tracks in a wagon.
Yeah.
And he hits it, and then the guy's sitting next to him. It's kind of funny. Like, he's just sitting there, like he doesn't even notice that he's not in the wagon anymore. And then the train explodes, and they both end up in the tree. Kind of like, it's just like
totally reminded me of Buster Keaton and his adventure.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that would happen to him. It's like, you get bounced into the passenger seat, of course.
Yeah, and this really demarcates those older books from the later ones. Were sort of like you're reading them going, all of this could really happen.
Exactly, and one of the reasons why I wanted to mention it is because I find it kind of sometimes slow going to read it, simply because I have to go back to make sure that what had just happened. It's and especially reading it in French. But I find that actually with bande dessinée and comic books and graphic novels in general, it's not easier to read just because of the pictures. Not at all. It's it's a different way of making sense. It's more cinematic, I think, than obviously than books. With just words, but it's a different kind of cinematic because of the ability to move back and forth.
Yeah, right? That's interesting. You can scan back to where you just were a minute ago. Yeah,
exactly. And I find
myself doing that a lot when I
read. Even if you're reading all straight through and fast, you're still looking back.
What happened? Why is this guy here? Oh yeah, right. This thing, right? Yeah.
I think that eventually the spread becomes the work. It's not. Yeah, if you know what I mean, the two pages open together.
Yes.
Even though it doesn't go across
I'm really glad you're mentioning this, because this is like a cinematic analysis of Tintin. I think that's really important, that the most of us who read Tintin books have read the 62-page albums that are, we didn't read the weekly strips that we were referring to earlier, most of us. And you're right that Hergé created them, especially in the later books, to be, you can hold it open and there's a coherence on those 2 pages. It's kind of like each 2-page has some story it's telling, and then sometimes you turn the page and there's something that changes, like surprises you too, right? That's a very common thing, right? Yeah, that's a really important point. I love that. I love your idea too, that the scanning up and down is very different from both reading. You could read a novel. Sometimes I go back and I kind of reread a sentence to make sure I understood what the dialogue was, but that's not the same as just glancing up and seeing the image and then glancing back down, right?
For sure.
That's a very.
I'm sure that comics theorists
have talked about this.
That, but this is my number one comic, I suppose. It's the first one that I read, and aside from the Peanuts, I guess.
Right. Yeah. It's probably something that people who are really into comic books understand as one of the axioms of comic books, real books, is that there are these things, and you have to have a kind of a splash image on the 2 pages to keep the person reading through, and then leave a little bit of a cliffhanger as you get to the end to have the person turn the page, kind of thing, right? There's probably a whole art that they teach. I don't know. Is there comic book schools? I mean, is that a thing? There are film schools, right? So I don't know.
I think it's a bunch of kids wasted youth, and some of them waste their youth and end up. Wow, I've met a few comic artists in my day as a bookseller. And,
what are they like?
They're unique.
Yeah,
they're unique. They're not like other authors. I'll tell you that. One of the great things about the comic artists is that they'll draw a little. And when they sign the book, they'll draw a little.
Oh, that is so cool! They do a little drawing. Yeah,
I remember that all the way from. Had a surprise visit at the bookstore from Lynn Johnston, the creator of For Better or Worse.
Okay. I remember that in the newspaper when I was a kid. Yeah.
And she was super nice. And she did that for absolutely everybody who came up to the table. So, that's, but I would say they're not as polished as authors. They're not used to the circuit, and they're not, they seem to be more.
That's interesting. They're more artistic in a certain kind of way.
In a certain way, and I think they're more interior too, which is interesting too.
Apparently, Hergé was. I mean, he was a great attention to detail. Apparently, as a person, he was not a very kind individual. I've read.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, some very.
I maybe don't want to know.
I know you don't want to have your image destroyed.
I've read a few books about Tintin and a little bit about Hergé, but one of the books that I haven't read is his actual the biography of him. I bought it in French thinking, oh well, now I can read French, but I never
reading it
never did crack it. Yeah,
I haven't actually read his biography, but I did read some. First of all, an interesting thing about him, he never had any children of his own.
Right, I knew that.
Right, because obviously he created this thing for children. It was made for children. And apparently I read somewhere that he was supposed to adopt, some nephew who lost a parents or something, and it was like a total failure, and he didn't really want to do it. And he was like, he met the kid, and the kid was scared of him. It was like some terrible story. Yeah, like we'd have to go and fact check the whole story there. But there was some very negative thing that happened with that, But just before we close up, I wanted to return to a couple of things. One of the things that struck me as you were talking about these crazy things that happened in the earlier books is we mentioned the fictional countries. So we talked, I mentioned Sildavia is, so I guess, sort of pastiche, and there's something sort of surreal about that that's almost as crazy. Sure. And the other ones are interesting, like there's San Theodoros we mentioned earlier, which appeared, and there's one called Nuevo Rico, which seems to be something like Brazil, because there's a place, a Sao city in that place.
Oh yeah.
Which is in so it seems to be some sort of a mock-up for Brazil somehow, which I don't really understand. But what's interesting about San Theodoros is it seems to be some sort of a mixture of a weak, small Central American state, like something like Guatemala or something, and maybe a larger one because it seems kind of big, like Mexico.
Yeah.
There's also one wink to my wife's country, the Dominican Republic, because throughout the series later on, especially the later, and it starts with the broken ear, there's Tapioca and General Alcazar.
Right.
Fighting with each other, and you know, so it's General Alcazar is originally a colonel, and then eventually becomes president, and all that. And then Tapioca later, you know, we're going to talk about that later, probably in the second part, comes back, and there's a coup d'état and everything.
Oh, very good.
And you notice in the later books, he renames the city Tapiocapolis, right?
Right, I remember Tapioca.
Remember that? And then Alcazar, I think Alcazar, when he takes over, this is at the end of Picaros, he renames it Alcazar or something, and that is actually the 35 or 33 year long dictator of the Dominican Republic. Trujillo was his name. Right. He renamed Santo Domingo Ciudad Trujillo. He actually did that, and that's, as far as I know, that's the only Latin American dictator who did that. So I kind of get the sense that Hergé was kind of looking at Latin America and sort of to create that country, sort of taking elements. You look at the imagery, it kind of looks like a slum in Mexico City in some of them. Like, you know, when you see them kind of walking along, it's all ragged. Picaros, I mean, you know. So that's a kind of an interesting thing that
I would say, but also a bit of Venezuela too, because there's the oil deposits.
That's right. Yeah, good, very good point. Right, the oil, because Venezuela and it's kind of different things altogether. Put together. What's interesting about all of the books is there seem to be sort of interspersed real places and real people especially real places with kind of made up ones, which is, as a kid, I didn't really notice it much, but as an adult, I sort of find it confusing in a weird way.
It's it's funny too, because I mean, one of the things about me is, especially as a kid, but I kept up all my whole life, is I'm just fascinated with maps. I love maps.
Oh, me too.
And so
that's another. I geek out on maps for fucking hours.
I probably knew the names and recognized the names of all real countries by the time I would have read Tintin. With that, I automatically would know whether it was a real country or whether it was
interesting.
And and I made up countries, and I would make up monarchical houses and all this kind of stuff, and draw maps of these. So
you would have noticed that as a child.
I would have. I loved it. I just thought it was awesome. I loved any kind of, and there's a lot of maps in Tintin. You know.
Many times there's they often show the boat arriving, like in Prisoners of the Sun, where you see the map of South America, Palau and everything, and all that stuff.
Yeah, and of course, a map in Red Rackham's Treasure is very important.
That's right. That's actually a treasure map. Yeah. I mean, I think is there some sort of a word for a person who loves maps, like a map of
I'm trying to remember what it is, but
I can open up an atlas and just sit there for hours and look at that. I don't know what it is about maps. It's kind of. And another thing I love doing with a lot of maps is, especially like in my own city of Montreal, is looking at maps. And then when I'm around the city, here's where the Lachine Canal connects. And so there's that and there's this, right? So I'm sort of connecting it to how it actually is in the world. It's kind of you put up a map of Windsor that made me think of you with that. Like, if you must do the same thing in Windsor.
And for sure.
Right.
For sure. And Windsor is such a simple city. But I put up a map of Windsor, which was just from a different angle, and it looks totally different all of a sudden. It's
interesting. It's kind of like those maps of the world where it's upside, where we would consider it upside down, but it's not, right?
Exactly. So looking south instead of looking north, and then makes all the difference.
Yeah, we have this like formed view that north is up and south is down from maps, right? I mean, that's where it comes, right? It's like it's trained our brains. The other thing I wanted to mention to you specifically before we jump off is, it's just getting back to this conservatism freedom thing. I can imagine that Hergé was probably a great promoter of free speech, because he had to suffer under the yoke of sort of having his speech be suppressed in the Nazi time. And I know that's a big hobby horse of yours, and me too.
It is, but I don't have anything to say about that yet. I'll see what.
Okay, maybe this could be an opener.
Something next time, based on further reading. But no, I'm nothing. Just
nothing pops out. Yeah, that's okay.
Except, of course, except that he is a reporter, that he believes himself to be free to go anywhere.
That's right.
And see anything, and I guess report somehow
and to
or other.
Speak about things. If he's a reporter, he's gonna right.
And when I say he believes he can go anywhere, I include other people's dwellings.
Right.
He's a I don't know if he's a burglar.
No, I think that's I think that's a very
Yeah.
pertinent observation that, the sense of freedom of speech is also I think freedom of movement is somehow connected to that as well. Well, they're both freedoms, let's say. And they're both present in Tintin and Hergé. He would have believed in those as axioms, and those are not obvious to people who, I mean, if you just, not to get hung up on some bullshit woke stuff or whatever, but I think a lot of people don't. I think a lot of people look at free speech today, a lot of younger people, and they kind of view it with suspicion. They think that free speech is kind of a code for sort of like old white guys who just want to hang on to power. It's kind of like, they just say that. What they really want to do is they want to hang on to the power they've got, because the world is a battleground for power, and the white males have all the power. So if the white males like free speech, that means that. Right. Right. It's kind of like, what? Does that make any? I mean, I'm caricaturing, but I'm just.
No, fair enough. I came to understand that, unfortunately, through interactions on social media, and I don't know what to say about it except it's the most important freedom, and
it is.
Without it, there is.
I really appreciate your dogged persistence with that, and how you push that. You push against hate speech laws. You push back against the hate speech courts. Like, you're very consistent and everything. I mean, I have on the door of my office, I have two quotes. One is the George Orwell. If you're not free to tell people things they don't want to hear, then you're not really free. Something like that. Like, if you can't say something someone doesn't want to hear, then it's not free speech.
Right.
If liberty means anything, it means the right to tell people things they want to hear, I think, is the actual quote. And the other one is Noam Chomsky.
Yes.
That's a very similar quote as well. I could be confusing.
But his quote is, if we don't support the freedom of
people we oppose, then we don't support it at all. Right.
Exactly.
Which is, it sounds like a kind of like a sort of a dogmatic statement, but it's actually, there's no freedom of speech. If I say, oh, well, hate speech, clearly we have to stop those people. The minute I do that, I'm just basically saying, as long as it's within the spectrum of what I think is safe, right? Then, I mean, that's not necessarily what I agree with, but I'm defining a limit to it in a certain sense, right? It's
it's a dangerous precedent beyond a shadow of a doubt.
So this is something I'd like to. Maybe we could return to that later.
I'll continue reading with an eye out for Tintin as a
freedom fighter,
reporter without borders.
Yeah. I mean, it's really. I think that that's a great way to think about it. And as we should sort of tease the next one. So. We're going to return to the idea of freedom, because it becomes even more pronounced in the later books. I think. I think it becomes the examples are much more intense. I'll recount to you something I do with my students about slavery, because I do a whole unit about slavery. But I'll do that in the next one. But there's also so just to kind of conclude where we are now. We're up to kind of about like Red Rackham's Treasure, maybe Prisoners of the Sun, something like that. Those are the fantasy books at the end of World War II, especially Red Rackham's Treasure. And we've got all the elements ready to go. And we've got this sort of the beautiful, really those books. I think Secret of the Unicorn is probably the first really amazing album. Right, like in terms of like the coherence of the story, it has a very complex, interesting story that connects all the way through to the end, and then picks up with the next one. Like, it's not even King Ottokar's Scepter, which I find great, is not, it's still got a kind of a bumpy, even though it's better than some of the earlier ones, and it doesn't have the levity of Haddock. It doesn't have, it doesn't have Professor Calculus.
Right.
What I love about Calculus is this, I love this, the way Hergé was looking at sort of scientists, the kind of absent-minded, brilliant scientist with a genius IQ who's kind of lost in his own calculations. It's kind of a sort of a beautiful image of kind of an Einstein or some other, maybe, and apparently he based it on some real scientists he knew. I've seen pictures. Well,
this is what I was saying about these proto-calculuses, and they're all scientists. It's like or professors, and it's like, this is a character that he likes, he wants to, and he keeps coming back.
Include him.
Eventually becomes one of Tintin's best friends and collaborators, and so it's
And so we see that Calculus too creates this incredible comic relief, because I mean, you were talking about how the Thompson twins sort of misunderstand each other. Calculus is really interesting because he's a little hard of hearing in one ear, is what he always says, right? When he's actually like nearly fully deaf.
Right.
And basically it's not that. He always understands pretty much the opposite of what the person it's always like whatever the person wants to get across, especially Haddock. It's not, and then they yelling at him and he's like, oh, wonderful, and they go off and there's, and so there's a kind of a deep joke too, just about, I don't know if it's like autistic type professor.
Oh, for sure. The whole spectrum. I guess so.
That a person who kind of ignores the social conventions somehow, but is still a very endearing character. It's still very good. Because they all love him, even though Haddock is constantly frustrated by him. When he gets kidnapped, it's like, we got to go save him. He's like our best friend or whatever,
Exactly.
Which is really interesting.
Let's not give away the second half.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, I'm just going to check if there's anything that nothing more that I wanted to, just for this closing up. The last thing I would say, just it's a technical thing, is the 62-page album format was actually because of paper shortages during World War II.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is sort of interesting. And it's so all of the albums, even the earlier like Congo ones, were reformatted into that 62-page thing. And it made them, it's sort of like the way that the Beatles music is kind of a set. It's a bunch of albums. Like, I don't know. It's like there's sort of there's a way you can evaluate Tintin. You can compare the books because they're all kind of, it's like a haiku has a certain number.
That's really cool that it comes from
a restraining
origin, but it's such an excellent restraint. It's so good.
Yeah, go ahead.
You don't feel like they're padded out, and you also don't feel,
they're just the right length.
Exactly.
And you get used to it too as a Tintin reader. Sure. I'm on page 31. I'm about the middle of the act or whatever, right? Like, it's
probably something that as kids we were trained into without even noticing it.
Yeah, that's right. It's sort of like, I mean, when you go back in history and you see some of the greatest artistic movements, often are people going around a certain constraint, finding creative ways. I mean, just dumb examples would be blues lyrics were often sexual innuendo, because they couldn't speak openly about sex, so they came up with these amazing sort of ways of talking about it in ways that are just beautifully poetic, and that comes from a restraint, a certain kind of restraint. Right. It's a similar thing, but okay, listen, Martin, I really appreciate it. I want to thank you again, and it may be a while before the next one, but we've got kind of food for thought, I think.
For sure. Yeah, you've definitely given, we have a few things that we got to actually
return to.
But then the other thing is, it's just a good idea to have an eye out for certain things as I'm continuing to read. Because I think I said to you already, I've never read them chronologically before. And it's an eye.
And you're enjoying that.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I don't think I have either, actually. I did it a bit for the preparation for this. I read Tintin in America, and now I'm reading the Blue Lotus. I'm trying to go back, but that's an interesting thing to do, is to literally go, because then you can see a kind of progression. Like you can really see it as you're doing it. Like,
and there is a little bit of usually not as much continuity between books, but there's certainly a little bit even very early on, the whole the drug trafficking in Cigars of the Pharaoh and Blue Lotus, and the characters are, so I mean,
Yeah,
I think it's just fascinating that how he built up these characters, both the good guys and the bad guys. I just think it's amazing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's hard. I mean, I wonder how, just it strikes me as we close on a sort of a philosophical question. How many people, like people listening to this, do you think a person who's not a Tintin fanatic could listen to this and get something?
I'm afraid not.
But yeah, I sort of get the impression probably not.
Yeah, I mean, how are you gonna? You can't spend the whole time describing the plot of these books.
It would be
also,
too complicated.
Like I say, there is, especially in the early ones, there's a whole element of randomness that you kind of just have to embrace.
So maybe that's something we should consider for the next one, is to spend a bit of time as we talk, because I did it with the King Ottokar's Scepter.
Yeah.
Maybe we should think of because I don't want it to be restricted to total Tintin heads.
No,
my colleague Benoit Metot, I talked to him today. He's a huge, just like us, he'll listen to this and be like, oh yeah, he'll be all into it. But I mean, does that mean we're gonna have 3 people listening to this thing? Right.
Well, on the other hand, Tintin fandom is a lot
it's pretty wide. Yeah. And also there are some people who have read, like my father, for example, he's read some of the books, and my brother too. He's not like a total fanatic, but he could listen to this and kind of, oh yeah, I know who that character is. And I remember that book that early one seemed sort of racist or whatever, right? They'll be able to kind of follow some of it, right? Okay. So that's something, some just for the future of just for the next one, what we're going to get into is the post-war era, where the books become, as I mentioned earlier, much better. The drawings and the complexity, and that sort of increases as you go through the 1950s, I think, and get into the 1960s. They get to a point of sort of like operatic Shakespearean, like they just turn into these amazing works. And it's sort of hard to believe that weird guy blowing up a rhinoceros, you know what I mean? It's like, it's hard so how did that turn into this character who's in the Red Sea, and involved in this incredibly complicated anti-slavery plot or whatever that's going on, So we're going to get into that. And so maybe I think probably to do that, maybe whenever we mention, we can have a little rule. Whenever we mention an album, would you say, okay, the plot of this one is X, and I can make some notes, and maybe
you'd better, because I might get lost in digressions about
no problem
rhinoceroses or whatever.
I love your digressions. I also really appreciate it. You seem to be bringing a more of a personal element, like your experience.
I mean, this is interesting. This is the thing. I don't know what exactly compelled me when I joined Facebook in 2011 or whatever it was, but I put Tintin up as my avatar, and I have
ever since.
Never felt the need to change it. It's not that I never show my face. It's simply that, like, this is me here.
Right.
All it is. I don't know. He goes all the way back with me to whenever.
That's interesting. So you feel like a personal connection to Tintin himself somehow.
Yeah, I'd say so for sure.
I'm not sure, because I remember as a kid talking about it with my friend Mark Gabriel, and he was like, "Oh, you're just like Captain Haddock or something. Like you're more like him," because I have a very irascible, sort of a more gregarious personality. Tintin has he's a very low-key, careful. If you watch him as a character, he doesn't talk as much as some of the other characters in the later books. He kind of watches, and
he's watching,
right? He's very smart, very observant.
He may be taking down notes that you just never see him doing. But no, he's an observer.
He's an observer, and it's right. Supposedly taking his notes to make his report or whatever. But what he's really doing is he's doing all his deductions of whatever the crime is. He's observing what's happening, and that's another thing I wanted to say quickly. Sorry, it just I love the kind of. Tintin is constantly an evidence-based person. He's like, okay, here's the traces of this, and like everything has to be there has to be a reasonable theory for him to accept something. And there has to be evidence, and he has to find the evidence. And that's a great lesson to young people, I think.
Oh, it's pretty good.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's interesting, but I would say, for sure, he's all about. That's why he's observing. He's all about the evidence, and he always is. He's always looking for something.
Yeah.
That's why he breaks into people's places.
Yeah.
Not just going in there to have a drink and
Okay, Martin, listen, thanks again. And we'll get to the next one whenever we get to it. I mean, there's no rush because, as I said, I got a lot of political things I'm doing. There's an election here in Quebec. And
yes, exactly right.
All right. So thanks
Good luck
again.
with that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to today's guest on the Mega Blast podcast. I've been your host, Jason McDonald. This podcast is brought to you by Arts and Opinion, an online journal, which is also available in the Permanent Archives of Canada. Visit us online at artsandopinion.com.